What's up guys, this is a quick tutorial on how to get multiple instances of Hand2Note installed on your system. Why would you want to do this? Because currently large HUD profiles with lots of stats really push the limit of Hand2Note. You're probably already familiar with having to deal with crashes and building errors on the stats, and it's very simply caused by the fact that you have too much data in your Hand2Note folder. The software is just not designed to cope with that sheer amount of definitions. Now, it could be the case that you have a large profile which just about runs on Hand2Note, but then you also have another HUD profile you want to run as well, another big HUD. And individually, these HUD profiles are going to run on Hand2Note, but when you put everything in the same Hand2Note install, it's just not going to work anymore. There's just too much data in the folder. Hand2Note can't cope with it. So if we could install multiple instances of Hand2Note, we'd get around that problem. Now, right now I have Hand2Note already installed, and I'm going to fire up the installer and you'll see what the problem is straight away. I want to install another instance of Hand2Note, but the installer is detecting that Hand2Note is already installed. And that's why it's only giving me these options, modify, repair, or remove. Well, I don't actually want to do any of those. I want to install Hand2Note again. The installer won't let me do it because Hand2Note is already installed. Now, in most cases, it's going to be in your C drive in program files. Let's just have a look at the directory. It's going to be important a bit later. So in C drive, program files, Hand2Note, this is the install. Currently, this installation has a lot of stuff in it, and you can just pretend that this is your current Hand2Note installation, and you just have lots of different HUD profiles here, and some of your stats aren't building correctly, and you're running into crashing errors as well. So we actually do have to uninstall this first. Now, one thing you can do is you can make a backup of your Hand2Note folder first of all. I've already done this because there's nothing wrong with this installation. Actually, it only has one HUD profile in reality. So I've just made a backup right now. But let's just imagine you've made that backup. Now you want to uninstall Hand2Note. So we're going to do that right now. We're just going to remove Hand2Note. And what this is going to allow us to do is to install Hand2Note again, which is what we want. So we'll go to remove. This process shouldn't impact any of your databases. Those are actually saved in a PostgreSQL database, so it shouldn't impact on those. You should still be able to access your databases after the reinstall. But of course, I'm not responsible if you lose your database, so feel free to back them up if it makes you feel better, but you should still be able to access your databases. So let's go to finish. Now you'll notice that this Hand2Note folder is still here, even though the software has been uninstalled. We can confirm that it has been uninstalled though, because if we run the installer, it's now asking us for a directory on where to install Hand2Note. So we can see the installer saying, okay, it's not installed at the moment. Would you like to install it in this location? We want to tidy up these remnants of what's remaining, because if you just reinstall Hand2Note at this stage, you haven't really solved the problem, because you can see all of our filters and stuff like that are actually still in the Hand2Note directory. It's only really uninstalled the software side of things. It hasn't really uninstalled the data side of things. So to get the best benefit from this, let's say your current HUD profile is not working because you're experiencing crashes. If you just reinstall at this stage, you're not necessarily going to solve the problem. We want to trace things back right to square one, which means we're going to delete this Hand2Note folder. We're going to pretend that Hand2Note's never been on this system. Shouldn't affect your databases like we mentioned. We're actually just going to delete that Hand2Note folder. So this time, after it's deleted, when we run the installer from Hand2Note, we know we're getting a completely fresh Hand2Note install, which is what we want in this case. So now that the Hand2Note folder's been removed, let's run this .exe. You can see it's automatically pointing to program files Hand2Note, and we're just going to install it in this directory. It's a pretty simple step. You've probably done this before. Just going to let the installer run for a bit. In fact, I'll pause and come back. So the installer is complete. We can see the Hand2Note folder has reappeared in C drive program files. It's asking us if we want to launch Hand2Note. We're not going to do that right now. Now, here's the thing that you really want to know. This is the slightly more technical aspect to this. If we enter into the Hand2Note directory, you can see that there is a .exe file here. So this is the launcher. This fires up the application. Now, anytime you use this .exe, it's purely using files within this folder. In terms of the data you need, such as HUD profiles, pop-up data, stuff like that, it's using everything that's within this folder. In other words, if we duplicate this Hand2Note folder and call it Hand2Note 2, for example, and run the exe from within the Hand2Note 2 folder, it's only going to use the HUD and pop-up data from within the Hand2Note 2 folder. So what this means is we can install different HUD profiles in different folders, and depending on which one we want to use at that moment in time, we can then run the relevant .exe from within inside that folder. Another way of thinking about that is, although we can't use the installer to create another installed version of Hand2Note, if we just duplicate this folder, so I'm simply going to copy this and I'm going to go to paste. And let's provide administrator permissions for this. I'll just pause while that runs. You can see that now inside program files, we actually have two different copies of Hand2Note. And these are essentially two different installations of Hand2Note. And we can create as many of these as we want. What I recommend that you do is leave this one as a fresh install, because then you can always duplicate that at a later point in time. If you want another instance of Hand2Note, you can just copy and paste this folder into the same directory. Let's imagine we're going to install a very specific HUD here. We can rename the folder. We can say that, okay, I'm going to install the Death Star HUD. So we could maybe just call this DS HUD. Now, the idea here is that if we run the .exe from within this particular folder, it's only going to be accessing data from this folder, so we can install our specific HUD on this HUD instance. Now, another way that you can achieve the same result, and the reason why you might want to do this is because if we just run typical installer for a HUD, so this is the installer for the Death Star HUD, and we'll have a look at which options we're given. Now, it's going to look for the Hand2Note directory in whichever folder we specify. Well, let's assume we want to install it into Hand2Note_ds_HUD. Well, we don't have that option. We can only point it to C drive program files, so we can't install to this specific installation directory. So here's another way of potentially achieving the same thing, is we actually go up one directory further. Let's create a new folder. And we're going to call it DS program files, which is standing for the Death Star HUD, DS program files. And we're going to paste our Hand2Note directory in this folder. So we actually are going to have a third installation now of Hand2Note available on our system. Let's just wait for that to run. Now just coming back to our installer, we can now browse for that specific directory. So if we head inside the C drive here, we're now going to look up that DS program files, and it's going to search for the Hand2Note directory within inside here. So just make sure that the installer reads C drive program files. Then when we run the installer, it's going to start populating this particular Hand2Note folder. So let's click install. If we open the directory, we'll see that it's already taken place. You can see the files are starting to appear inside here. We go to config and then filters. We can see the Death Star folders are beginning to populate right now. Now this will take a couple of minutes to run. So once again, let's pause and let the installer complete. So now the HUD is completely installed. Let's just say we fire up this particular instance of Hand2Note. So it actually just goes straight to the .exe file inside this directory. And that would fire up the Hand2Note instance with the Death Star HUD installed. Let's say we verify and everything's working. Well, it's good to make a backup. So we can just right click and we can choose add to Hand2Note.ra. Now in the future, if anything breaks with your installation, and this is for any of your HUDs, it doesn't have to be the Death Star HUD, any HUD that you've got installed, you can create a fallback installation, create the .ra. If something stops working and you want a quick fix, you just come here, you delete your Hand2Note folder, and then you can extract from the .ra backup that you've made, and your HUD's going to be working again. Now if I use the classic method of pulling up a program in Windows that many people probably use, which is to perhaps search for it here, and I run Hand2Note. In fact, let's just check out that instance. Let's go to open file location and see which .exe is being run here. We get taken to a shortcut. Let's have a look at the properties of that shortcut, and we can see it's pointing to C drive program files Hand2Note, Hand2Note.exe. So if I run this instance of Hand2Note, I'm actually running the fresh instance of Hand2Note, not the one that I've just installed a bunch of stats on. And we'll see that in practice. Let's just pause while we wait for Hand2Note to pull in the updates and start working. Now, firstly, you can see, although this is a completely fresh install, It even says Hand2Note free version down the bottom, so we haven't registered this yet or anything. It's connected immediately with the PostgreSDB because it's still using the same Postgres credentials, so it's able to pull the data from that database, even though this is a fresh Hand2Note install. So even though we deleted the Hand2Note folder, we actually still have access to our stats. If we have a look in the stats editor and just see if we have any stats which don't come as part of the default Hand2Note installation, we can see the answer is no. We just have a blank install here of Hand2Note. Any stats that you see in these folders, if there are any, are actually stats that just ship with Hand2Note. So fresh Hand2Note installation here. Now let's imagine instead, we don't want the fresh installation of Hand2Note. We want our new HUD that we've installed. Well, we put that in C drive DS program files, Hand2Note. Let's fire up this .exe instead. We're actually pulling up a different instance of the Hand2Note software. Now, this will probably take a little bit longer to load just because there's a large amount of stats in the directory. So once again, we're just going to pause this and continue once the software has fired up. So you can see it's actually connected to the same PostgreSQL database. But this time, if we head into Stats Editor, we're going to see that it's pulled in all of the different stats that we want to see. If we double click on a player in the window, we can see that although the stats haven't been built for this particular HUD profile, that the HUD is actually loading up along with all of our pop-ups. So all we need to do at this stage is make sure our HUD is selected in game types and the pop-ups are selected in game types, do a clear and rebuild, and we have the working HUD only on this specific Hand2Note instance. Now, just because we have different instances, I guess it doesn't mean you can run them both at the same time. You can still only run one instance at a time. You can see this is a very useful way of managing different HUDs and making sure that each individual instance of Hand2Note doesn't become overpopulated with too many stats and too many HUD profiles. Then as a result, you start running into crashes and build errors. All right, hope it's helpful. Thanks for watching, guys.